morning. Thank you for the privilege of being here. Look forward to the opportunity. It's a good thing I went shopping yesterday in my car because I was listening to the radio and they said, don't forget to turn your clocks ahead. And I totally never made the connection between preaching this morning at 9:30 and the clocks being turned ahead. So thank you for car radio for helping me to be here. Otherwise, I'd probably just be showing up. Well, I might have shown up somewhere around now, but you'd be a little worried. Where is Gord? So, Instruments of Our Own Destruction is the title of the sermon, and I will be referring to those passages and reading a number of them throughout the sermon. So I'm not going to read them in advance. I'll just read them as we come up to them. And let me get the little advancer thing here. Okay, all right. There's something morbidly fascinating about seeing other people's mistakes, misdeeds, and outright stupid behavior that led to epic fails. We know we shouldn't look or laugh, but we're drawn to take a peek when we have the opportunity to look at people's failures. YouTube's Epic Fail channel has thousands of clips of people doing stupid things and failing, and often very painful failures. And there's a never-ending supply of viewers to look at epic fails, millions of them. The reality, of course, is that people mess up and do stupid things. And yes, a chuckle here and there at people's misfortune may be deemed by some to be okay, but my hunch is we'd feel differently if they were chuckling at us, if that failure were our own. Now, when I was younger, the age of many of you here, I often thought about being famous or making my mark in the world. But now that I'm older, I recently passed the 50 mark, I've slowly shifted and started thinking in terms of legacy. So how do I want to be known in terms of Gord? What will people think of when they think of Gord? My hunch is that somewhere deep inside of us, those of us who are over 50 and those of us who are quite a bit younger than 50, and there are a number of you here, think about your legacy. Think about making your mark in the world, establishing a reputation, building a sense of credibility and identity in the community. And my hunch is that each one of us here in this room does not want our lives to be just another epic fail. That people take a peek at, people get curious and they look at our lives to see an epic failure. My hunch is that we don't want to be that person. The trouble is that despite our desire and our stated aim to be passionate disciples of Jesus, we often work very hard at being just that, an epic fail. Years ago, I had to go to Philadelphia, and I drove 8-ish hours. And to pass the time driving, I got a novel on, well, I call it tape, but it's whatever it is. It's MP3 or something. Anyway, I was listening to this novel, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. And so I'm listening, and I always have a notepad beside me. I'm not texting, but I have a notepad. One line struck me, and I quickly made note of it. I just jotted it down. This is what he says. I know not what to call this, that hurries us on to be instruments of our own destruction, even though it be before us, and that we rush upon it with our eyes open. It's like, bam, I thought, there it is. I've got to write that down. I just wrote instruments of destruction. But why is it, he says, that we are willing to be instruments of our own destruction, even when we see it coming? We still go ahead and do it. And so today I want to talk about being instruments of our own destruction. Conduct that eventually leads to a tarnished legacy, that leads to a damaged witness, that leads to causing destruction in our lives and in the lives of others. Now, to do so, I want to look at two people, and you see the two people here, King Solomon and Martin Luther. Two people who had absolutely everything going for them. Everything going for them. But ultimately, both had a tarnished legacy. Now, this isn't meant to be a curious peek at their lives, at their failures, kind of chuckle, ho, 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 look at King Solomon, what a fool. Martin Luther, ho, 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 what a fool. No, that's not what this is about. These people have something to teach us through their success, but also something to teach us through their failures. And so what I want to do is look at two people who, now they wouldn't have stated it this way, this wouldn't be their language, who wanted to be passionate disciples. But they claimed to know God, and they sought to serve God, and while they were separated by centuries, their experience is incredibly similar. Let me see if I can get this to advance. The other one, maybe? There we go. They both had a great start. And so I want to start by reading 1 Kings 4, 29 to 34. 1 Kings 4, 29 to 34 gives a statement about King Solomon's wisdom. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. Then the author lists a bunch of people that he was wiser than. And his fame spread to all the surrounding regions. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. People of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. This is a famous king, King Solomon. He had a great start and he had a great benefactor. His father, of course, was King David, the great King David, who established the kingdom. Well, Saul established it, but then very quickly David became the king, became the mighty King David, author of passages of Scripture. So he had a great father, a great benefactor who established him as the king, and David blessed him before he died. And when we read of King Solomon's reign, we read that it was a glorious reign. He expanded the borders of the kingdom of Israel. He suppressed the enemies of God's people. He developed the economy. He built two magnificent buildings. One was the temple. He was the builder of the temple. And when we read 1 Kings, we get a description of the incredible money and energy expended into the building of the temple. The expansion of the borders, but also the building of his palace. Two incredible works of art and construction in the world of antiquity. He had a very impressive resume, accomplished great things, and people from all over his world heard about him and then traveled to come and see the great works of Solomon and to hear of his wisdom, to experience his wisdom. And Jerusalem and Solomon was a magnet. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And we read that in 1 Kings 4. Famous. Great start. Amazing start. Martin Luther also had a great start. He also had a great benefactor. He had Frederick the Wise, one of the most powerful politicians in Germany. Does this have a pointer thing? Is it the little starry thing in the middle? Okay, so Martin Luther's around here in the city of Wittenberg, modern-day Germany. And so he has the support of Frederick the Wise, who's one of the great princes of his day. And he is the leader of, Martin Luther's the leader of a reformation that's taking place here in Europe that is transforming the church in the 16th century. He's a giant. He expanded reforms throughout Europe. He was a key founder of Protestantism, a movement today that has over 500 million followers. So he's a giant. Solomon was a giant in his day. Martin Luther's a giant in his day. In fact, we're worshiping here this morning. How we worship this morning, the placement of the pulpit, the types of music we sang and were led by, the way in which we carry out our own personal devotions, all were shaped by Martin Luther. We're not just happening today sort of in a vacuum. So much of what we as Protestants do, believe, and practice is shaped by him. He's a giant and has been for the last 500 years in terms of impact. In fact, this is the 500th anniversary. This year is the beginning of the 500th anniversary of his reforms. He's a man of letters. He wrote continuously to followers and detractors. If you go to a library that has academic books, 52 volumes of his writings. It's a massive work. You could spend your life just reading Luther's works alone. And he was famous. People from all over his world came to hear the words of Martin Luther. In fact, there's a book called Table Talk. People would sit at the table. So Martin Luther's there. Visitors would come. They'd sit at the table, and they'd ask, well, Martin Luther, what do you think of this? Well, Martin Luther, what do you think of this? And he would respond, and people would quickly write it down. And they would build books of Table Talk, Martin Luther's words. He's a giant in his day. King Solomon, great start. Accomplished great things. Martin Luther, great start. Accomplished great things. He was a giant. Actually, in his day, Martin Luther was portrayed as a giant. And if you could read Latin in the upper, it says, the Hercules of Germany. He's the giant and that's him with the club in his hand. He's going through Germany, reforming the church, clearing out false teaching. And he's the giant. He's the hero. He is the superstar of the 16th century. But both of these men had a poor finish. Great start, poor finish. Now let me read from 1 Kings again, but this time 1 Kings 11. So the opening chapters of 1 Kings just summarize over and over again all the great accomplishments of Solomon. But then we get to chapter 11. King Solomon, however, and that's a big however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughters. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They are from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your heart after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been, he followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. Both of these men were instruments of their own destruction. Or to use the words of Jeremiah 7:4, through your own fault you will lose the inheritance I gave you. There's this element of being responsible for your own behavior. Solomon accomplished great things, but he loved foreign wives. And he loved a lot. 700 wives, 300 concubines. The Israelites had been told, do not intermarry, do not marry these other women, because they will turn their hearts after other gods. Because as you marry these other people, those household gods are now introduced to your household. And they will turn you. They will shift your affections. And that ended up being the case of Solomon. For we read that he eventually began to offer sacrifices to foreign gods and not follow the Lord completely as his father David did. He started very well. He did not finish well. He had a tarnished legacy. Martin Luther had a very poor finish as well. In the early years of his ministry, Martin Luther urged his followers, be kind to the Jews. Give freedom to the Jews. And he wrote on that and instructed his followers. Treat them with love and grace and kindness. But near the end of his life, he wrote horrible things about the Jews in his final few years. One of the works he wrote, infamous work, on the Jews and their lies. And that's it on the left-hand side. And he said, burn their synagogues, raze their houses. In other words, destroy their houses, confiscate their books, ban their teaching, and deny safe conduct on the roads. His words are so harsh that there are those who make a connection between Luther and Nazi anti-Semitism because it's similar kind of language. Now, I don't think it's a fair comparison because Luther would never have supported the Holocaust. But the language was harsh and mean-spirited and angry and brutal. But the very fact that people can make the connection between Luther's language and Hitler's language is just shocking. He started so well. He was a giant. He was famous, doing marvelous things for the church. But like Solomon, he didn't finish well. He blew it. He was an epic fail in this regard and left a tarnished legacy. Now, I find this very scary. Very scary. Your theme is looking up to Jesus, making passionate disciples. If I were to ask you, well, it's too late. I already put the PowerPoint slide up. But if I said, what's important for making passionate disciples of Jesus? Like what are the kinds of things you do? Or if someone were new to the faith and they looked at you and said, oh, okay, I'm new to this Christian faith. Please help me. What should I do to be a follower of Jesus? You would probably say these kinds of things, right? Well, first of all, you should know the scriptures. You should do the work of the Lord. You should seek wisdom. You should participate in worship. And you should do your personal devotions. And all will be well, because that's what you're supposed to do as a Christian. Well, this is what's scary. Know the scriptures. Well, Solomon wrote parts of the Bible. Did he know the scriptures? Yeah, he wrote parts of the scriptures. He knew the scriptures. And Luther translated the entire Bible into German. Did Luther know the scriptures? Oh yeah, he knew the scriptures. Do the work of the Lord. Well, did Solomon do the work of the Lord? He built the temple. He did the work of the Lord. He strengthened the kingdom. And Luther built a reform movement to reform and revitalize the church. Seek wisdom. Solomon sought wisdom and was blessed by God with incredible amounts. And he wrote the book of Proverbs in your Bible, which is what? Wisdom literature. Luther had wise people all around him. Great leaders that spoke into his life. Well, certainly participating in worship is important. Well, did Solomon participate in worship? Well, he built the temple and then conducted services within the temple, and we can read of those in 1 Kings. Luther wrote hymns to get people singing. And even today, I don't see any hymn books. Do you have hymn books? No. What's a hymn book? Nobody has hymn books anymore. But if you had a hymn book, I have to explain what hymn books even are nowadays. It's a book filled with hymns. And at the very back of it, it has an index. And in the index, you have a list of authors of hymns. And you could look up, and you would usually find hymns of Martin Luther. And so, did he participate in worship? Of course. And he encouraged people to by writing hymns. And have personal devotions. Well, I don't know about Solomon. But Luther prayed daily. And he kept a private confessor. He had someone that he confessed his sins to every day or every week. And he kept that until his final days. And developed beautiful prayers and beautiful hymns. This is what's scary. We know these things are supposed to be what we're supposed to do in order to be disciples of Jesus. But are they 100% guarantee that we will not end up in epic fail? No. That's what's scary for me. It's not 100% guarantee. If you do these things, you will end up with an untarnished legacy. No, there's something else. There's something else going on. What did they do wrong? They did all these things. They did all the things you're supposed to do. What did they do wrong? These were people who knew God. How did they still manage to be instruments of their own destruction? And how do we avoid a similar tarnished legacy? Well, it's not a guarantee. There's no magic bullet. There's no panacea that ensures we are not going to end up in the epic fail hall of shame. With that in mind, this morning, I have a very modest proposal to keep us from the epic hall of shame. And that is to get each one of us to ask ourselves, what is my ticking time bomb? What is my ticking time bomb? What sin is lurking in the background? What sin continually besets you? What sin is a ticking time bomb that's just tick, 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 just ticking in the background that someday will go off? Well, what was Solomon's ticking time bomb? For Solomon, it seemed to be sexual passions. Any man who needs 1,000 women to sleep with has lost all perspective on love, sex, and human intimacy. When did that time bomb begin to tick? But it was ticking over and over again. For Martin Luther, it may have been pride. I mean, you can only take being called German Hercules for so long before you start to think that you are a giant and don't need to listen to people. So it may have been that. You know, he's a superstar. He's a rock star. And superstars and rock stars tend not to listen to other people. They surround themselves with people that basically tell them what they want to hear, because their entourage is, there, but they're only because they stroke the leader. And is that part of Luther? Perhaps, maybe. But one thing we do know is that Luther had a temper. We know in the early years of his ministry, he had a violent disposition that caused trouble for him. We know that that was a bomb, ticking, 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 for decades in ministry. It was there. It was there. People knew of it. He knew of it. And it seemed to be under control for decades of his ministry. But by the end of his life, boom, this explosion towards the Jews. But with Luther, that temper wasn't the only ticking time bomb. He also had absorbed a deep-seated medieval prejudice towards Jews. In his early years, he seemed to have rejected that prejudice. But in the later years, that prejudice came back with a vengeance. And boom, the bomb went off. So we have a sense of what Solomon's bomb was. We have a sense of what Luther's bomb was. But what about us? What's our ticking time bomb? If we were to stop and get away from the noise, a quiet place where we can actually hear, but in this case hear ticking, what would we hear? What would be the ticking? What would we find? It's difficult to hear our own ticking time bombs. Complicating the hearing process is the fact that as Christians, especially those who are leaders, you can be corrupted. You can be corrupted by power, you can be corrupted by pride, you can be corrupted by prestige, your reputation that you must maintain. There are all kinds of things that can keep us from hearing this ticking time bomb. And pastors and leaders and professors and those who are in positions of Christian leadership, it's even harder to hear because you are expected to act a certain way and to not even acknowledge that you even have a bomb. Well, theoretically I might, but I really don't. No, we all must listen for this bomb. It's very difficult for all of us to be honest with ourselves at the best of times, let alone when people are fawning over us because we're famous and powerful. And it's difficult to think that normal rules apply when power skews what appears to be normal. And it's next to impossible to listen to tick, 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 tick when power and pride have blinded and deafened us. But I propose this. We may not hear the ticking time bomb, but I can almost guarantee that others have heard your ticking time bomb. I can almost guarantee that your spouse knows of your ticking time bomb. Your kids hear the ticking time bomb. Your friends hear the ticking time bomb. Your boyfriend, your girlfriend has a sense of what that ticking time bomb is. And my suggestion is to ask those around you, those who love you, those who care for you, and say, what is my bomb? What is my ticking time bomb? Now, it's hard to hear. It's hard to hear the bomb, but it's also hard to hear the words of people telling you what that bomb is. But ask, what is the bomb ticking in the background that could blow up and tarnish my witness and my legacy? Because really, ultimately, it's not about our legacy. It's about our Christian witness and what kind of impact we're to have on the kingdom. Complicating this whole process, and with this I'll end, complicating this whole process is our human condition. And that is why I appreciate the prophet Jeremiah's commentary on being instruments of our own destruction. In Jeremiah 17, in the opening verses, Jeremiah, of course, is reflecting on the destruction of the kingdom. By this time, by the writing of Jeremiah, that kingdom that Solomon had established, it's gone, or it's in the process of being destroyed. The Assyrians have come, then the Babylonians have come, and the kingdoms are on their way out. And Jeremiah is basically writing and saying, this is why, folks, the kingdom was destroyed. This is why. And these are the words that he uses. He says, through your own fault, you will lose the inheritance I gave you. Well, that's not really comforting words from a prophet. Hey, guess what? This disaster that's upon you, it's your own fault. Hard to hear. Then he says that Judah's sin was engraved on their heart, so much so that it impacts future generations. The prophet Jeremiah said, your sin is engraved on your heart. It's not just there. It's so deeply embedded that it's marked in your heart. And then, it's not just so deeply embedded that it's hard to get rid of. In verse 9, he says, our hearts are deceitful, so that we can't even begin to make an accurate assessment of ourselves, to heed or to hear the ticking. In other words, Jeremiah is saying, there's simply no way to get out of this mess. There's no way. And you're saying, Gord, what a wonderful message. There's no way to escape this. But that's not where the story ends, because Jeremiah in verse 10 and verse 14 offers hope. He says, paraphrase, that God knows our heart. And our only real hope is to cry out to God for mercy and to cry out for God for healing, and to use the words of the prophet, and I'll conclude with these words. Heal me, Lord. Heal me of what? Of this ticking time bomb. Heal me, Lord, and I will be healed. Save me, and I will be saved. For you are the one I praise. Amen.